So anyway, Bernard's our third speaker. As mentioned, he's the executive editor of Newsroom Pro, which is an online news platform started by Tim Murphy and Mark Jennings. He was formerly the editor of interest.co.nz and publisher of Hive News. He was also the head of digital at Fairfax Media and managing editor at Telecom and Extra MSN. So he has enormous background experience as a financial journalist, and his past work has included working for Reuters and the Financial Times Group. So coming from a slightly different angle, but certainly with a fascinating range of experience, please give Bernard a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's great to be here to talk about public interest journalism from my point of view. I think this is a increasingly crucial topic, and we've seen in the last 2 or 3 days how our changing media landscape has changed our world. And it's not always a good change, I have to say. But I come to you with some experience over the last 20 years of trying to do public interest journalism on the internet and dealing with the changes we've seen in how public interest journalism is funded. I started out as a financial journalist for Reuters and began producing news online actually back in 1994 when Reuters had its very own early version of the internet, which was essentially on everyone's trading room desks in financial market platforms. So we used to put out headlines that lasted 140 characters long. And it meant that when Twitter came along, we knew exactly how long to put our headlines out. I then launched a news service called Reuters.com, based out of New York in 2000-2001. I launched an operation called ftmarketwatch.com, which was a free financial news service in 2001. Reuters.co.uk in 2003. I ran Extra MSN 2004-05, and then was head of digital at Fairfax 2006, 7, 8. Then jumped out to do a startup, interest.co.nz, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then have been running subscription news services for myself with Hive News, and then with Newsroom over the last couple of years. So I feel like I can say that I sort of understand how the business models for news work, how they have changed over the years, and what I think will be the way we can fund public interest journalism in New Zealand from here on. And to try and explain the problem that we have at the moment, I just wanted to do what any economist would do, and I'm trained as an economist, which is explain the price of something. and try and give you some understanding of the issues facing journalists and their bosses right now, most of them in New Zealand at the moment. So still in New Zealand, most of the big media companies, so that's Fairfax, what's now called Stuff, NZME, which owns the Herald and a bunch of other newspapers, and News Talk ZB, TVNZ, which, although it's publicly owned, you could argue is now completely commercial, and MediaWorks, which owns NewsHub, which has a news service on both TV3 and lots of radio stations. They all have this same business model and have had it for 20 years, which is to give away their news online and then to hope to get big enough audiences around that news that they can monetize it, make money, by having advertisements around that news. And that model is based on a promise, essentially, that was made 20 years ago by Google and by others, that there would be enough money from this advertising to pay for that news. And at least initially, it seemed like a good deal. We give our news away for free, Google crawls that news, ingests it into their databases, makes it easy for people to find, people click on the link and they come through to the website, and then we put up advertising around that news and we make enough money from the advertising to pay for the journalists. Because increasingly the news that's on newspapers and on television, although mostly on newspapers at the moment, is that advertising is drifting away, and increasingly it's going online. And that was the model. So 20 years we've had this model. And the way that this model works is to sell these ads, and you might see them, little skyscraper ads on the side of your web page, or a little banner ad at the top, or one in the middle, and you might even see them online on your phone if you don't have an ad blocker, which, by the way, 50% of people do now. And you would make around about, and this is 10 years ago, around about $40 per 1,000 what they call page impressions. So you sell ads, you sell 1,000 of these ads, and you make $40. So that was the price back in 2007-8 for a news website. And I know this because I was running Stuff at the time. So the price was $40. And you made $40 for every 1,000 page impressions. Now fast forward to 2019, and that price has dropped to around about, at best, $4. So when your price of your product goes from $40 to $4, the only way you can make enough money is to sell a lot more of those things. So if you've got tomatoes, the price goes from $40 to $4, you now have to sell 50 container loads of tomatoes instead of 50 boxes to get the same amount of money. So you get a sense of the scale of the problem, which is you have to give away, and increasingly give away, huge amounts of your product, news, to get the money that you need to pay for the journalists to produce the news. And so that means you adopt increasingly desperate measures to get people to look at your news. And so that means a lot of what we call clickbait. Has everyone seen these headlines that say 10 ways to, look at Sonny Bill Williams with his shirt off, or, Kim Kardashian with no clothes on, look at this, or whatever it is. And we've all seen it, and it's increasingly dominated the two main news websites, so Stuff and particularly New Zealand Herald over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's a problem, because essentially it destroys trust in media, and it's a race to the bottom. So the lower the quality of the news, the less advertising revenue you can make from the news. It's like a downward spiral. Eventually get to a price of naught, from $40 to naught. So, about 4 or 5 years ago, I realised that this was happening, and I could see it in particular when Facebook and Google started to really get traction in New Zealand, and they were making most of the money from the advertising revenues that were coming in. So I decided to stop giving away my news, essentially, and start asking people for money for that news. Which seems like a strange thing to do in this world, and even now most New Zealanders don't expect to pay for their news, they expect it for free. And here's where we have a particular economic concept I want to try and explain to you, and you'll understand it, which is what I call the tragedy of the commons, right? So when you have something that's free, and you put it out there for everyone to take, they will take it, and there'll be a mad scramble for it, and more than likely they'll ruin it. So let's say you have a free bucket of water in the middle of the park, and you say, this water is for free, and everyone goes, fantastic, there's a shortage of water. Everyone runs towards it, they knock the bucket over, they pollute the water, it's a mess, and the water's useless, it's polluted. It's not there anymore, it's run away. And that's essentially the problem we have with news now. It is a tragedy of the commons. And it is what we call a public good problem. That means there are some things in the world which we need. Water, food, shelter, stability, security. And that's why, as societies, we've developed public institutions to provide those public goods. Things that we think we all need, and that if they were all free, we'd ruin them. So that's why we have publicly funded water networks, we have publicly funded healthcare systems, publicly funded education systems, and to an extent, and to be frank in New Zealand, a very small extent, a publicly funded public interest journalism system. And the one thing we have left really in that space is Radio New Zealand. So I wanted to talk about before we hand over for questions, a few ideas I have, how we can use that essential infrastructure we have to distribute that public good, which is public interest journalism, how we can beef it up, and also how we can address some basic problems we now have with the media that most of us consume the most. So firstly, we have this, I think, still fantastic resource and infrastructure in Radio New Zealand. This is our only true public interest journalism and media platform. And it has extraordinarily, over the last 4 or 5 years, produced an awful lot with the same resources, and often a lot more, and reached a lot more people, I believe, with those same resources by improving its website, by developing its podcasts, and by starting to develop its visual and audio-visual capacity, as we've heard earlier. And it is a fantastic platform, which I think could be used to create more public interest journalism in New Zealand by using it to fund or to pump through more public funds to do that. Now that's already sort of happening. We've heard about the funds that have been developed in conjunction between Radio New Zealand and New Zealand On Air, but I think more could be done. And here's a couple of starters for 10. And I have to declare not a conflict of interest, an interest here in that Newsroom, the organisation I work for, has already started working with both Radio New Zealand and New Zealand On Air. I'm involved in producing a podcast called 2 Cents Worth. It's a business and economics podcast that's broadcast on Radio New Zealand after the midday news on a Sunday. I suspect not today, because Radio New Zealand rightly is focusing its efforts on covering the massacre in Christchurch. And it's put out as a podcast. This is a joint venture between Radio New Zealand and Newsroom. We also have a joint venture coming up, which I think has come out of the fund, which is a daily news podcast that starts later this year. And also Newsroom has worked directly with New Zealand On Air to fund an investigative unit led by Melanie Reid, which is starting this year as well. Which is fantastic. Thank you very much, Ruth, and to Radio New Zealand, John, for all of that. So that's one way in which you can fund or put money into various channels to provide this public good. But Radio New Zealand, I actually think, is a fantastic platform for doing that. And I'm slightly frustrated that it's taken quite a while for the new government to get that money pumping through. But I think there's some specific things that could be done. And the first one I wanted to put out here, which I haven't talked about in public before, is an idea for Radio New Zealand to build substantial newsrooms in the regions of New Zealand. So this is a team of journalists, maybe 4 or 5 per newsroom, and big enough to be able to handle people being off sick or going away on a holiday, and cover a region like, for example, Gisborne, or Whangarei, or Greymouth, or Invercargill, New Plymouth, Wanganui, places like that, which are increasingly seeing fewer and fewer journalists funded by the commercial media as these newspapers dry up and die. And also increasingly as the mainstream radio networks and TV networks pull back from those regions, where maybe they had a full-time reporter in, let's say, Dunedin or Invercargill, they no longer do, or if they're a radio station, they no longer have reporters there or full-time radio stations operating in those places. And I think Radio New Zealand could build these newsrooms in these places. Let's say you put 50 people into 7 or 8 of these newsrooms around the country. We're talking $5 or $10 million in funds. When they produce their news in text, audio and audio-visual terms, it is, as it is now, distributed through other media, for example, other newspapers, other radio stations, and is available publicly to use on both Radio New Zealand's platforms and privately owned platforms in those areas. It would beef up provincial news, which I think is one of the areas where it's most needed. And actually, $5 to $10 million sounds like a pretty cheap price to monitor and to hold accountable the $3 billion worth of funds being spent through the Provincial Growth Fund at the moment. So that's one idea. And I think maybe the Provincial Growth Fund is maybe not the right platform or tool to put it out there, but I think if you're interested in provincial news, holding local government and others to account and actually covering New Zealand broadly, particularly some of the people in poorer areas, and frankly, a lot of those provincial areas are poorer than the big cities, and that is one way to do it.
Do you think that'd be more important than hot pools?
Yes. Yes, indeed. 5 to 10 million. They're spending 3 billion in that fund, and actually it isn't being very closely monitored.
And hot pools in Punakaiki and
Yes,
Hanna.
that's right. Yes. Wouldn't it be great to have a bunch of reporters covering all that money that's being spent and, you know, showing us what it's being spent on and making sure that it's clean and tidy? Because one of our biggest risks in New Zealand is that local government is not covered very well now in local media. There's been all sorts of things to show us that without sunlight, democracy can be corroded. And finally, another idea to put out there, which has really preyed on my mind in the last 2 days. And I wanted to read out a tweet to you that was put out yesterday afternoon by Ruth Harley, who is the media reporter for the Washington Post, who's written an excellent piece in the last 24 hours, which you can find on New Zealand Media actually as well. The New Zealand Massacre was live streamed on Facebook, announced on 8chan, reposted on YouTube, commentated about on Reddit, and mirrored around the world before the tech companies could even react. So, on Friday afternoon, that horrible event happened. It was recorded live on a GoPro and broadcast live on Facebook. That stayed up for more than an hour on Facebook before Facebook took it down, but in that hour, that was enough for many of these horrible ultra-nationalist groups, all sorts of people saying all sorts of horrible things, and as we've found, doing one absolutely atrocious, horrible thing, to take that and to weaponise it online through putting it up on YouTube, other parts of Twitter, Facebook. So now it is impossible to pull that down. It is everywhere. It's like a virus that's just spread, and now you can't remove it. I think that Google and Facebook and YouTube should be pressured, regulated, protested against, to the point where they change their policy on publishing material, where they view it and monitor it and moderate it before it's published, not after it's published. And we should pressure those companies to do that by using regulation, by using the power of the government to refuse to pay money to these companies. And here's a little factoid which you may not have heard yet. By my estimate, the government, central government and local government in New Zealand, and their companies and agencies, so that includes, you know, NZTA, Air New Zealand and others, and local government, so we're talking Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, all of those organisations. So we're doing about a third of the economy here, at least a third of the economy, probably more like 40% if you include local government. Currently spend, by my estimate, $100 million a year on advertising on Facebook and Google and Twitter and other online sources. That is almost 3 times more than it spends on Radio New Zealand. And by my estimate, the government spends, Ruth, you're probably a bit closer to this than me, but probably $200 or $300 million on public media, if you include the various platforms and channels. Māori television, New Zealand on air, Radio New Zealand.
250.
Yep, 250.
Yeah, yep, 300 sounds too high.
Yep, 250. So about half the amount that it spends on public media, it already spends giving to a couple, 3 or 4 American-based companies who paid in 2016 less tax in this country than I and my family members paid personally to the government, let alone everyone in this room. So, there's a couple of ideas out there. I've spoken for much longer than I should have, and I appreciate the time, but I wanted to get those ideas out there and hopefully create some debate.
That's great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Bernard. Do we have a specific question for Bernard quickly before we throw things open? And also we'd like to invite Sarona to speak briefly.
Thank you, Bernard. Well, my name's Donald McDonald, I'm a bit of an identity. But anyway, you mentioned in your main presentation about podcast. I don't think I've ever done a podcast. And is this democratic that even poor people without money can? Do you have to have a phone? Do you have to have a plan, a data plan? And how can I do this? Well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm keen to do that. Whether I should be going to a podcast.
Yeah, can I answer that by saying you're very welcome to listen to 2 Cents Worth on Radio New Zealand National after the midday news on a Sunday. And so that's available for everyone, and I'm guessing you're a regular listener to Radio New Zealand National. Yep, so there's that. Secondly, you're right, you do need probably a phone or a data plan or be able to connect to the internet. I must say it's now increasingly easy to get podcasts through smartphones, through either the Google-powered ones or the Apple-powered ones. And the number of people who have these smartphones and who have these cheap data plans, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm guessing it's well over 2 million in New Zealand. So they should have access to those tools, and increasingly they do. I know you don't, but they are there. So I think this is one of the reasons why I think Radio New Zealand is the best platform at the moment to funnel those public funds through, because they still have a large existing audience and platforms that most New Zealanders have access to. They still broadcast in AM and FM to most parts of the country, but they also have these new ways to distribute, which actually take a lot of work. Try to distribute a podcast on your own. It's hard, particularly to get going, for the very reason that Apple and Google and Facebook need you to have done a lot of work and have some scale to basically give you a leg up. You need a good Google page rank and all sorts of things like that. So that's why I think Radio New Zealand is a great way, there's a great infrastructure there to funnel these funds to get the biggest impact and in the cleanest way, because some people get grumpy about public funds going to private companies, and if it was all to come through Newsroom, I'd love it if that happened. But people go, oh, well, that's a private company, they're going to make profit. We don't like profit. Well, Radio New Zealand is very clearly all about public interest and is loved, and it's done a fantastic job. And we're very pleased that we were able to partner with.
Okay, Miles.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick question? It's really easy to buy an ad on Facebook because you just click on the few buttons and before you know it, you've got your ad and you can see it there and it starts working. Why haven't the large media companies like NZME and Fairfax stuff also gone down that route of making it really easy to buy adverts that way?
The simple answer is they're not able to employ, let's say, 100,000 engineers with PhDs to build and run these websites. So when you're, and I used to be the head of digital at Fairfax, we were competing against all of that engineering muscle and also the huge network effects that these companies have spent a lot of money building up and are now making profit from. So the internet essentially is a series of network monopolies now. Google owns search, Facebook owns social, Amazon owns e-commerce, at least in the English-speaking world, Netflix owns streaming TV, and and to break into those networks and to get the scale that you need to be efficient and cheap is extraordinarily difficult. In fact, that's why competitors to Google and Facebook and Amazon and Netflix and Apple to an extent, although they're more in the hardware than the software game, is incredibly difficult. So you say, wow, couldn't they make it just as easy as Facebook? Yes, they could, but they'd have to employ 1,000 PhDs to do it and build enormous platforms to do it and then become incredibly popular. So the reason Facebook can make it really easy is because they've got 4 billion users and have revenues, I think 16 billion a quarter now. They can afford to pay for all this engineering and this testing and A/B testing, and actually they use New Zealand as a guinea pig often to do it. We're a nice small market for that. But that's the guts of the problem. You're up against behemoths that I think need to be A, regulated, and B, probably broken up Here's a little factoid for you. Elizabeth Warren, who's running for president in the United States, is campaigning to break up Facebook, Google and Amazon. She put an ad on Facebook saying, let's break up Facebook, and they took it off.
Funny that.